Joining me now with more on the international response to Russia's war on Ukraine is Kerry Buck. Ms. Buck is a former Canadian ambassador to Nato. She's now a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa School of Public and International Affairs. Ms. Buck, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Let's start with NATO, which you have a long experience of. What are you watching for over the next few days? There are going to be some more decisions and more announcements out of NATO in the coming few days. What are you watching for?
Right. There's a foreign ministers meeting that's starting this evening in Brussels, so probably a couple of hours from now, and it'll last 2 days. What's interesting about this meeting? It's part of a series of in-person meetings that is aimed at ensuring that NATO allies stay firmly and completely aligned in their messaging. There's a lot of moving parts right now. There was an OSCE special meeting today, UN Security Council special meeting today. There's a G7 meeting on Ukraine, and there's the NATO meeting. So all of those moving parts in diplomacy have to be kept together, so there's one consolidated message of resolve that is being consistently sent to Vladimir Putin. So what's going to happen at NATO? They will obviously discuss Ukraine, and I expect ministers to decide to significantly ramp up support to Ukraine, more heavy weaponry, more advanced weapons systems, more support to protect against use of chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, more cyber resilience. I also expect that neither NATO nor individual leaders will be too detailed about what they're providing. That's part of the strategy of and security concerns they have. So there should be more coming out of that. The second thing on Ukraine, there'll be more pressure on Russia. NATO doesn't decide sanctions itself, but there will certainly be conversations about the application of sanctions at the NATO table. And I would expect EU decisions to be forecast out of the NATO meeting and possibly decided this.
We'll get to that in a second. I want to ask you with a bit more specificity. I know we don't know exactly what NATO is going to announce, but we were talking with MPs on Friday who are here in Ottawa, and they were very explicit. I mean, what they want is, as you mentioned, heavy armaments, armored personnel carriers, heavy guns, howitzers, shells, which they're running out of or they don't have, but even tanks. Do you think NATO would go as far as providing battle tanks?
Well, individual allies decide what they give, and they give what they're, as far as they're willing to go. And we've seen in the recent past that the U.S., for instance, hasn't been as keen on providing planes, fighter jets, that kind of thing. So we'll see how far they go, and not all of it will be visible, to be frank.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, because the war's entering a new phase, it's about the heavy weaponry, about advanced weapon systems, but it's also about sustainment for the Ukrainian fight. So logistics, medical, a whole host of other pieces of support that they'll need to continue. Because what's happening right now is Russia's pulling out of Kiev, but they're going to reman, rearm, resupply for what will probably be a major onslaught in the Donbass in weeks to come. And so Ukraine has to be ready for that. And it promises to be bloody.
I want to take you up on something you said. You've mentioned it twice now, and it's very interesting. You mentioned that the NATO countries are, we'll get to sanctions, but NATO countries here are not necessarily going to advertise what they're giving. Is that because of the lesson that we learned from that Polish proposal to provide MiG fighters to Ukraine? It went public. It got very public exposure. Then there was a public airing of the fact that those fighters would be sent to an American base in Germany, and the whole thing was pulled down because it would attract the ire of Russia. And that part of the gift of this is to try and do it on the sly.
That's definitely one of the reasons. There's another one. But yes, NATO solidarity and unanimity is part of NATO's power, right? It's the political advantage it has. And so it gets really difficult when some NATO allies push ahead publicly on proposals in an effort to push their fellow allies, and it crumbles. And that's not a good thing for NATO, and it's not good for messages of resolve. So that's part of the reason. But the other reason is, you know, Ukraine's security interests, too. They don't have an interest in having the other side, the enemy, know all of the hardware they're getting. It's not useful to them in waging their war of resistance against Russia.
Okay. Sanctions, you mentioned that you anticipate a ramping up of sanctions. We're hearing reports that the European Union is discussing, they're not boycotting Russian oil or gas, the countries are still dependent on that, but they are discussing a possible boycott of Russian coal. But even that is creating tensions among the member states of the European Union. What do you make of it?
Well, I mean, the EU's done a lot in terms of sanctions so far. They've gone farther than they were prepared to go in 2014, for instance, after the Russian invasion of Crimea. And so that's a good thing. But it is clear that there is room on Russian energy supplies for further tightening the screws. Russia's budget, a huge part of it, is fed by their energy sales. And it's really hard to sustain. And I would expect and hope that the pressure on Europeans to start to wean themselves more quickly off of Russian energy sources. Yeah. I hope they'll move fast on that. I won't hypothesize.
Okay.
I'm hopeful, but I don't know how optimistic I am.
Okay, last point. In his address to the United Nations Security Council, President Zelensky today called for a World War II-style, Nuremberg-style tribunal to prosecute Russian atrocities. He says that the current system's just not working. He literally tore a strip out of the United Nations Security Council. What do you make of that proposal in terms of investigating war crimes?
Well, yes, absolutely. The evidence is starting to mount that there are war crimes, crimes against humanity, and potential genocide underway. And the key right now is to build that evidence base that is ironclad and solid. We're seeing Russia already start to deny, and they're using a playbook they've used consistently over the last few years. They used it after bombings in Syria. They used it after the Salisbury poisoning. They've used it after the downing of the passenger jet over Ukraine. And so, honestly, it's ludicrous messaging coming out of the Russian state saying it's all staged. But even if it's not all staged, we didn't do it. Lies upon lies upon lies. It's shameless. Yeah. Shameless and speedy messaging out from the Russian government. So really important that evidentiary basis be built for the war crimes. And Canada traditionally has played a pretty important role in doing that in past crises.
Yeah, we have RCMP officers already on the ground, from what I understand.
Sure, and that's great, but I think it's also important to do other things to help other states, help ourselves collect evidence from victims, provide psychosocial support so victims aren't re-traumatized, preserve the evidence from masquerades, provide forensics teams, provide lawyers and investigators who are really schooled in sexual violence and conflict so that they know how to handle that evidence. These things take a long time, but it's important now to set, the international community sets itself up to be able to prosecute and bring Russian leadership to account for these international crimes.
Okay, Kerry Buck, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks, my pleasure.